Chapter 13. Caught in the Trap. I heard the sound of aircraft, more tanks and soldiers moving in, installing barricades. It seemed that within an instant they had organized a siege on the place, complete with loudspeakers barking orders. Only then did Laboa appear. "I was out of the country when all this happened, and I raced back," he said, ushering me into a small anteroom downstairs. "I thought perhaps I could be of some help. Can I offer you some wine?" I was thirsty and said I preferred a beer instead. There was none. "You're obviously tired. Why don't you sit here and rest for a while and we'll prepare your room," Laboa said. "Monsignor McGrath had been staying here, but he's gone now." "What's the matter? Didn't he want to see me?" I asked, making a small joke. "Well, you know how it is," said Laboa, grimacing. "I don't want you to consider me here under asylum," I said. "I don't want you to tell anyone that I have asked for asylum, because I have not. I am here against my will. Tell no one that I have come here in any official capacity at all." "But I've already told the Americans you're here," he said. I walked out into the main hall of the embassy. I was taken to a bedroom upstairs that had obviously just been abandoned by McGrath. It still had the fetid smell of cigarette smoke. I could see that the churchman had been using the Vatican embassy as a command post. In his hurry to avoid seeing me, he had left behind a number of things on the small desk. Notes with names and messages, several telephone numbers. Ironically, the boy cleaning the room was the godson of the newly installed president, Indara. He took away all the papers. I sat down and started to make some telephone calls. Villanueva quickly ordered that the phone be removed. In time, it became evident that Laboa's concern was not to act as neutral negotiator, but to concentrate all his energies on convincing me to give up the fight. During this time, I think that Laboa was actually in worse shape than I was. First, there was the subject of the deafening rock music. The Americans placed huge loudspeakers outside and started playing scorching, diabolical noise almost immediately after they laid siege to the embassy. It was a roaring, mind-bending din, although I was off in my own thoughts and meditations and paid little attention. There were a number of nuns who served as cooks and aides at the residence, and they were all very tense and distressed. But none so much as Laboa, who was really the one to crack under the torturous music. He appealed to Cisneros directly to cut the music off, saying he couldn't think about negotiating with that infernal noise. Later, we were able to reconstruct the game played by the Americans. Our ambassador to Sweden, Elmo Martinez, had an apartment right near the nuncio's enclave. Elmo, who was home on leave, could focus down on the street below and observe Laboa and Villanueva meeting with the Americans. Villanueva in particular was passing along information daily to the U.S. Army about everything that was going on inside the Vatican embassy. Villanueva was a very nervous man, the compulsive sort. He was a snake, ill-mannered and obnoxious with the people at the embassy, deceptive and distant in the way he spoke. I could see that he was an informer, that he was telling absolutely every detail of what was going on. Anything anyone said would be reported back to Cisneros. He provided written reports to Cisneros. He spoke with Cisneros. If we used the telephone, he went running down immediately to the gate, calling for the Americans. Collaborator that he was, he also drew up a map showing the layout of the embassy, including the locations of my quarters, so the Americans could plan for what they wanted to do. We have photos showing Villanueva meeting with the Americans at the gate of the embassy, giving them the map. My room was in the rear, flanking another building. Right behind the room was a parking lot. Once informed by Villanueva, they repositioned themselves with monitoring equipment and telephones so they could be as close to me as possible. Although it was obvious that Villanueva was informing on me, he made efforts to talk to me. He was seen quarreling with Laboa's assistants and did everything he could to toss around his authority. The Basque exiles especially detested him. He acted as if we were supposed to know each other, but I told him I had not even seen a picture of him before. "General Thurman is very upset that you were able to slip through his surveillance," he said. "He's asked Monsignor Laboa and me to hand you over for better or for worse." "And just who the hell are you supposed to be, anyway?" I asked sarcastically, copying the tone with which the Basques treat Villanueva. "It's no surprise. You're just like the Basques," he said. "You are one of them. You've been protecting those wretches for 10 years, but I am the representative of Archbishop McGrath." "Why don't you go say hello to Thurman and Cisneros for me?" I said dismissively. "Tell them the guy they were supposed to kill is alive and well." Every day, surrounded, we could hear the tanks and the airplanes and helicopters and the sound of chanting demonstrators. The same demonstrators as always, with their fancy cars. The poor folk were not in support of this, nor did they have anything to celebrate after the Americans invaded their neighborhoods and killed their friends and relatives. As the days went on, I was wondering how long the standoff could last. One possibility was that the Americans would eventually downgrade and drop their guard. I would have to wait them out. Alternatively, if I had to surrender, I would at least surrender to a Panamanian. But the Panamanians placed in office by the Americans didn't want that. Their Attorney General, Rogelio Cruz, said that if I turned myself over to Panamanian authorities, they would have no way to deliver me to the Americans. The Panamanians definitely wanted the Americans to take me and solve their problem. I asked Gaitan if he knew where the weapons were that I had brought into the embassy, the grenades, the AK-47 machine gun. He said they were gone. Someone had handed them over to the Americans. I had access to another weapon, an Uzi, thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Arnulfo Castrejon, who had arrived at the church residence sometime after I did. He was able to smuggle in the weapon through his brother, a doctor, who visited him daily. Eventually, the brother was able to take Castrejon home, and the Uzi stayed with me. I did the best I could to hide it, but this wasn't easy. I was in a very sparsely decorated room, with a desk, a bed, and nothing more. So I put it between the mattresses of the bed. I considered the Uzi a defensive weapon, and under the circumstances, surrounded by the American armed forces, this seemed logical. I never for an instant considered taking hostages, nor killing Laboa or anyone else, although Laboa himself told me that the Americans were circulating such rumors. Laboa laughed at the idea. He knew that this was something I would never do. Neither did I even for an instant think of committing suicide. I can't relate to the idea of killing myself. I was using my gray matter to come up with an escape plan, and I was analyzing the odds of coming out alive. Death was only to be an option in the line of fire. Finally, on January 2nd, Laboa called a meeting. Gaitan and Colonel Nivaldo Madrinan, the only other top-ranking officer in the embassy with me, were also there. He said that he saw no other option than for me to be seized by the Americans, because the next day they were going to remove immunity and the doors would be open. The Americans will let in the mob, he said. They'll do the same thing they did to Mussolini. That is, they would hang me and leave me strung up for everyone to see. But how can the Americans declare that this residence no longer has immunity? I asked. It isn't up to them. Well, he said, there's nothing I can do. In fact, once he decided to invade Panama, George Bush was trampling all over international law, along with his new allies installed in the Panamanian Foreign Ministry. They had disregarded diplomatic immunity, raiding the Nicaraguan embassy, abusing the Cuban ambassador, and violating the grounds of the Libyan embassy. They had organized a mob in front of the Peruvian embassy, where some PDF officers had taken refuge. People in the crowd threw Molotov cocktails, threatening to storm the place and drag the exiles out. I reminded Laboa that at the beginning of the ordeal in the embassy, he had read to me proudly a salutary letter from the Panamanian lawyer, Dr. Materno Vasquez, congratulating him on offering asylum, advising him of the principles of international law and the details of the Geneva Conventions, and describing how these principles offered a legal foundation for what he was doing as chief of a diplomatic mission. I reminded him of the initial diplomatic response from the Vatican, invoking my right of obtaining refuge, just as the United States at that very moment was offering shelter to a Chinese dissident in Beijing, despite the demands of the Chinese government. I called the Cuban ambassador, Lazaro Mora, and asked if they were doing the same thing at the Cuban embassy, that is, threatening to take away its immunity. No, he said emphatically, they cannot do that. And the telephone line suddenly went dead. I had taken advantage of the phone lines being turned on by Cisneros, so arrangements could be made for the uniforms they would bring me when I was captured and in their custody. When the Americans heard the gist of the conversation, however, the line was quickly turned off again. Madrinan started to protest, and Laboa was ready to argue. The bishop was looking for the support of my aides. Surrender, he said, was the only option. What about Spain? I asked. They refused to give you asylum, said Laboa, who was close friends with the Spanish ambassador. Okay, what about Cuba? Laboa never gave me an answer. Obviously, he never contacted the Cuban embassy, even though Mora was prepared to accept me. The truth was that the United States made it clear they didn't want anybody to offer me asylum. I left the meeting and started to prepare myself mentally for what was likely to come. I knew I had a weapon to defend myself. The Uzi was my insurance, I thought, because if the mob or the Americans were going to come in, at least 3 or 4 would go with me before I was lynched. That was the American plan, not the Panamanian plan. Thurman had planted the idea with Laboa. Once diplomatic safeguards were removed, they would find a pretext to shoot. Thurman warned that he would do nothing to block the mob of 50 to 70 people that they had ringing the embassy. It was Thurman who brought up the specter of Mussolini and the lynch mob. I went to my room and reached between the mattresses. My Uzi was gone. Someone had found it and delivered it to Mark Cisneros. I was left to ponder what Laboa had said. Look at it as losing one battle, he said. Accept that and prepare yourself for the legal battle ahead. The only way now is legal recourse, impartial justice, untainted by politics. Your lawyers have been calling me and are awaiting you with optimism for the legal fight ahead. Looking back on it all, my choice was capture by the Americans or to face a long-term future there in the Vatican embassy, or perhaps an eventual attack by the Americans. I could not blame Laboa for what had happened. I had known him for a long time. Prior to this, our relations had always been professional and honest. We had worked with him on sensitive investigations, and when he asked us to keep confidences, we did and still do. He was an affable man, a generous host, and a good conversationalist. Laboa carried out his instructions from the Vatican as far as he could, based on international law. In many ways, Laboa saved my life, but he was a victim of intrigue. Analyzing things as dispassionately as I could, it was obvious that Laboa, pressured by McGrath, Cisneros, and Thurman, had decided to deliver me over to the U.S. invaders. He was not waiting for an emissary from the Vatican, a priest who was also a specialist in international law, who had been dispatched to meet with us and help analyze the case. I understood Laboa's psychological profile. I knew he was nervous and vacillating in his political decisions. This was something that McGrath also knew. Laboa had another weakness. He feared public criticism. He ended up being hurt by the whole affair. The Vatican transferred him to Paraguay, the demotion to a distant outpost seemingly a rebuke. From there, he sent word through a mutual Panamanian friend, Lisf Arocha. Tell the general that he has my admiration. Send him my regards and tell him I'm sorry. Staying in Panama under the government's jurisdiction was not a legal option. The Attorney General, Rogelio Cruz, refused to assume any responsibility, even though he contended that they had charges pending against me in the Spadafora case and others. The next day, January 3, 1990, everything was done with precision. All that Laboa did and said was part of a cover story to prepare the way psychologically to turn me in. Laboa said as much afterward, that he had to use a little subtle psychology to be able to fulfill his mission. They brought me a uniform. I changed and went downstairs at around 6 p.m. A line of people had formed at the door, first the nuns, the Basques, the Panamanians, and finally Villanueva. It was deeply moving, and the human emotions were varied. Tears, forceful handshakes, almost suffocating embraces. The wife of one of the ETA militants asked that I not be turned in. At the end of the line, Villanueva extended his hand to me. I looked at him, saying in a voice loud enough for all to hear, "We will see each other again." I remembered what Laboa had told me. Our only assurance in loyalty is that God will never abandon us. He gave me a Bible and placed a rosary with a cross on it around my neck. I was forced into an American helicopter at the start of the trip to Miami. The details after my capture have been well documented. The real story of how the American justice system railroaded me into a long jail term has not.